In autumn 1621, Wampanoag leader Massasoit heard gunfire echoing across the Massachusetts forest. Within minutes, 90% of his warriors mobilized, convinced their English allies at Plymouth were under attack. But when they arrived at the settlement, weapons drawn and ready for battle, they found something they hadn't expected. The colonists were shooting birds for a harvest feast. What happened next would be twisted, rewritten, and weaponized for centuries, becoming a story so divorced from reality that even the food we associate with it is mostly fiction. Almost nothing you learned in elementary school about Thanksgiving actually happened. The Pilgrims never called it Thanksgiving. The Wampanoag weren't invited guests who showed up with warm smiles and open hearts. They arrived because they thought their allies were in danger. And what followed was not some harmonious cultural exchange, but a tense military alliance held together by desperation and mutual need. To understand what really happened in 1621, we need to go back 3 years earlier to 1618, when something apocalyptic was unfolding along the New England coast. European trading ships had been visiting these waters for decades, exchanging metal tools and wool blankets for beaver pelts and other furs. Disease-carrying rodents infected with what modern epidemiologists believe was leptospirosis, a bacterial infection that attacks the liver and kidneys with brutal efficiency. The Wampanoag called it the Great Dying. Within 3 years, approximately 2/3 of their nation, 45,000 people, were dead. Entire villages were wiped out overnight. Children, elders, healers, leaders, gone. The Massachusetts people lost 90% of their population. The mainland Peconicut were nearly extinct. Imagine if over the next 3 years, 2 out of every 3 people you know died from a mysterious illness that no one could explain or stop. Your knowledge keepers, your historians, your teachers, most of them gone before they could pass on what they knew. The social fabric doesn't just tear in a situation like that. It disintegrates. Languages begin to disappear because there aren't enough speakers left to sustain them. Ceremonial knowledge vanishes because the people who held it died before they could teach the next generation. Agricultural techniques developed over centuries are lost forever. This is the world the Mayflower sailed into on December 21, 1620. The Pilgrims didn't discover virgin wilderness waiting to be tamed by European civilization. They found a post-apocalyptic landscape, a graveyard of nations. Plymouth itself was built on the bones of a Wampanoag village called Patuxet, abandoned when every single inhabitant died from the plague. The colonists found cleared fields ready for planting, freshwater sources already identified, and even stores of corn buried in the ground, which they promptly stole. They walked through the ruins of homes, saw the skeletal remains of families who had died with no one left to bury them, and called it Providence. Meanwhile, across the forest, Massasoit was making calculations that would determine whether his people survived or disappeared entirely. The Wampanoag had been reduced from about 70,000 people to fewer than 25,000. Their traditional enemies, the Narragansett to the west, had somehow escaped the plague through geographical isolation. They still had their full military strength, their full population, their full ability to wage war. Massasoit knew that without allies, the Wampanoag would either be absorbed or annihilated by the Narragansett within a few years. That's when he looked at the English, 103 of them, including women and children, clearly struggling to survive their first winter in a land they knew nothing about. If you're starting to realize that everything you were taught about Thanksgiving was a carefully constructed lie, you're not alone. The true story is so much darker and more complex than the myth we've been fed. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep uncovering the real history behind the stories we tell ourselves, because what comes next gets even more disturbing. By March 1621, half the colonists were dead. These weren't conquistadors or professional soldiers who knew how to survive in hostile territory. They were religious separatists who had spent the last 12 years living in Dutch cities, working in textile mills, completely unprepared for New England winters that could kill you in a single night of exposure. Massasoit made his move carefully. He didn't send just anyone to make contact with these desperate foreigners. He sent Tisquantum, known to history as Squanto, and this choice was calculated with surgical precision. Tisquantum spoke fluent English, having been enslaved and taken to Europe years earlier by English traders who had no qualms about kidnapping indigenous people for profit. He had lived in London, learned English customs, even stayed in the house of a shipbuilder. He had returned to find his entire village, Patuxet, the very place where Plymouth now stood, completely dead from the plague. Every person he had ever known, gone. We only have 2 eyewitness accounts of the 1621 harvest celebration, and neither one calls it Thanksgiving. The first comes from Edward Winslow, who wrote a letter to a friend in England describing the event in maybe 200 words. The second is from William Bradford's journal written 20 years after the fact, when memory had already started to blur the details. Between these 2 sources, we have maybe 500 words describing what actually happened, and from those 500 words, we have built an entire mythology. Here's what Winslow wrote. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent for men on fowling, that so we might after a special manner rejoice together after we had gathered the fruit of our labors. The hunting party returned with enough birds to feed the colony for a week. The colonists were practicing military drills, firing their muskets in celebration of their survival. This is when those gunshots echoed through the forest to Massasoit's village about 40 miles away. The Wampanoag had dealt with European violence before. Fishing crews who came ashore, kidnapped people for the slave trade, and sailed away before anyone could retaliate. When Massasoit heard sustained gunfire from Plymouth, he assumed either his allies were under attack or they were planning an attack themselves. He gathered 90 warriors and marched to Plymouth, and when they arrived to find a celebration instead of a battle, diplomatic protocol demanded they stay. The Wampanoag didn't come empty-handed. They brought 5 deer, which would have provided more meat than all the birds the colonists had shot combined. For 3 days, the 2 groups ate together. But this wasn't some harmonious cultural exchange where everyone held hands and sang songs about unity. The language barrier alone would have made real communication nearly impossible. Only Tisquanum and 1 or 2 others could translate, and everything had to be filtered through them. The Wampanoag warriors likely camped outside the settlement walls. The colonists remained armed and suspicious. Both sides were maintaining a tense military alliance built on mutual need, not celebrating friendship or shared values. And here's what they definitely weren't eating. No cranberry sauce, no pumpkin pie, no mashed potatoes. Potatoes hadn't even reached North America yet from South America. The colonists had no butter, no wheat flour for bread, no oven capable of baking pies, even if they had wanted to. Sugar was so expensive it might as well have been gold dust. What did they actually eat? Venison, definitely. Wild fowl, which included ducks, geese, and yes, probably turkey. Corn, but not on the cob ground into meal and made into a kind of porridge. Squash and beans. Shellfish like mussels and lobster. They drank water and possibly a weak beer made from barley. But here's the most important thing about this meal that no one tells you. The colonists didn't call it Thanksgiving. In Puritan theology, a Thanksgiving was a specific religious observance that you couldn't just declare because you felt grateful. It required a clear sign of God's providence, like rain after a drought, victory in battle, survival from disease. It involved an entire day of prayer and fasting followed by a communal meal, with ministers preaching for hours about God's mercy and humanity's unworthiness. The first official Thanksgiving in Plymouth didn't happen until July 30th, 1623, almost 2 years later. So if the 1621 feast wasn't Thanksgiving, and the Pilgrims never called it that, how did it become the centerpiece of American mythology? That story involves a widow named Sarah Josepha Hale, a failing tourist economy in Plymouth, and Abraham Lincoln using gratitude as a weapon during America's bloodiest war. In 1827, Sarah Josepha Hale sat at her desk in New Hampshire, writing by candlelight after her 5 children had gone to bed. Her husband had died 5 years earlier, leaving her with no income and a family to support. She turned to the only respectable profession available to widowed women of her social class, writing. But Hale wasn't just writing anything. She was crafting a novel called Northwood, and in it, she invented the modern Thanksgiving dinner with almost supernatural precision. She described roasted turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, the exact menu that would become the template for American Thanksgiving dinner. By 1836, she had become the editor of Godey's Lady's Book, the most influential magazine in America. And for 30 years, every November issue called for a national Thanksgiving holiday. She wrote personal letters to 5 different presidents. She published Thanksgiving recipes, Thanksgiving stories, Thanksgiving poems. She single-handedly created the cultural infrastructure for a holiday that didn't yet exist nationally for 23 years. Presidents ignored her. Then came 1863. Abraham Lincoln was presiding over a country that was literally killing itself. 50,000 men had died or been wounded at Gettysburg just 3 months earlier. Draft riots had torn through New York City. Lincoln's own son Willie had died in the White House the year before. On October 3, 1863, Lincoln issued a proclamation that transformed Hale's dream into reality. But he didn't just declare a holiday. He revolutionized what Thanksgiving meant. In the middle of the bloodiest war in American history, he talked about blessings and bounties. He made Thanksgiving explicitly inclusive, inviting every part of the United States, even the South in active rebellion, to observe it. And here's what he didn't do. He didn't mention the Pilgrims. Not once. For Lincoln, Thanksgiving wasn't about the past. It was about holding the present together and imagining a unified future. The Pilgrim myth came later, manufactured by Plymouth boosters trying to save their failing economy by creating tourist attractions, and origin stories that placed English Protestants at the center of American identity. By the 1870s, school children were learning the Pilgrim Thanksgiving as historical fact, even though almost none of it was true. Every element of modern Thanksgiving, from the date we celebrate it to the food on your table, emerged from specific political calculations and economic needs, not tradition. The harmony between cultures that supposedly happened in 1621 was invented by people who needed Americans to believe in a founding myth of peaceful cooperation, even as the descendants of those same pilgrims were systematically destroying indigenous nations across the continent. The real story involves a catastrophic plague that killed 45,000 people, desperate alliances forged in the shadow of extinction, and centuries of myth-making designed to make us forget what actually happened. What we call Thanksgiving is a monument to America's ability to transform trauma, violence, and calculated survival into a comforting story about gratitude and unity. The question is, now that you know the truth, can you ever look at Thanksgiving the same way again? Leave a comment below and tell us, does knowing the real history change how you will all think about Thanksgiving this year? Or does the myth still hold power even when we know it's not true?